A city block detonated without fire, without impact, without a single visible attacker. Supes dropped mid-flight like puppets with cut strings, eyes wide, bodies unmarked as they slammed into asphalt. Civilians ran from an invisible threat that never chased them. Security footage showed a man walking calmly through the smoke, long hair unmoved by the wind, armor gleaming under flickering lights. He didn't look at the Supes collapsing around him. He didn't need to. When Homelander arrived expecting a terrorist, he found his own teammates kneeling in the street, whispering to people who weren't there. They begged forgiveness from hallucinations only they could see. They didn't recognize him. Inside Vought International, analysts confirmed the impossible. No energy signatures, no compound V anomaly, no sonic or chemical attack. Just people losing control of their minds in the presence of one man. His name, pulled from an untraceable biometric scan, surfaced too late. Madara Uchiha had entered the city, and the collapse of Vought had already started without a single punch thrown. You're about to watch a system built on fear meet someone who understands control better than it ever did. Subscribe once, because what happens next won't be battles, it will be judgments, and missing them means losing the thread of how this world unravels. The first Supe collapsed in midair over 7th Avenue without warning. No explosion, no projectile, no visible opponent. He simply froze mid-flight, eyes wide as if seeing something no one else could, then dropped 30 stories and hit the street hard enough to crack the pavement. Pedestrians screamed and scattered, expecting a second attacker that never appeared. 2 blocks away, another Supe stumbled out of a bank robbery scene, clutching his head and shouting at empty space. He fired his energy blasts wildly at phantoms only he could see, shattering windows and cars before dropping to his knees, begging someone invisible to stop staring at him. Police footage later showed him whispering apologies to the air. Within 15 minutes, 5 Supes across Manhattan were incapacitated without a single mark on their bodies. Cameras caught the same figure, walking through each affected area. A tall man in red segmented armor, long black hair falling behind him, sandals quiet against broken glass. He didn't run. He didn't look at the chaos. He walked as if he were touring a museum exhibit that bored him. Inside Vought International, analysts tried to find the common denominator. No heat signatures, no electromagnetic anomalies, no chemical dispersal, no sonic interference. Every Supe's vitals showed extreme psychological stress without physical trauma. One technician whispered that it looked like collective psychosis. Another pointed out that collective psychosis didn't follow one man down the street. They zoomed in on his face from a traffic camera. The system failed to match him to any database. Facial recognition returned nothing. Biometric scans from the footage read as human, but with eye movements too precise, too focused, as if he was processing more information than the camera could record. They labeled him unregistered enhanced. They were already wrong. High above the city, Homelander listened to the emergency chatter through his earpiece, irritated by how frantic it sounded. Supes didn't panic. They caused panic. He dropped from the sky onto a street filled with overturned cars and trembling civilians, capes settling behind him with practiced authority. He expected to find a villain, a terrorist, someone loud. Instead, he found 3 Supes kneeling in the street, staring at something that wasn't there. They were crying. One reached toward Homelander and begged him to make the red eyes go away. Another kept repeating that the sky was falling, though the sky above them was perfectly clear. None of them reacted to his presence like they normally would. Homelander's jaw tightened. He looked up and saw the man walking calmly toward the next intersection. No hurry, no fear, no interest. Homelander called out to him, voice carrying across the street. The man didn't turn. That alone irritated him more than any insult could have. Homelander stepped forward, ready to assert control physically if necessary. Before he took a second step, one of the kneeling Supes grabbed his leg. Not to stop him. To warn him. He whispered, "Don't look into his eyes." Homelander shook him off and flew forward anyway. From a rooftop across the street, Billy Butcher watched through binoculars, expecting to witness the usual spectacle. He had come to document another Vought disaster. Instead, he saw something that made him lower the scope slowly. The man didn't react when Homelander landed in front of him. He simply stopped walking. For a brief moment, they stood face to face in the middle of a wrecked street, sirens wailing in the distance. Homelander spoke first, demanding an explanation, demanding identity, demanding submission to a hierarchy that had always worked before. The man looked at him calmly. That was enough. Homelander froze mid-sentence. His eyes widened, not in pain but in confusion. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear something from his vision. He looked around at the street, at the cars, at the civilians, and his breathing changed subtly. He took a step backward. Butcher leaned forward on the rooftop, heart pounding. He had never seen Homelander step back from anything. On Vought's screens, analysts watched biometric data spike erratically from Homelander's suit sensors. His brain activity showed patterns associated with extreme stress and visual hallucination, but there was nothing in the environment to cause it. The man in armor finally spoke. Not loudly, not aggressively, calmly like a teacher addressing a slow student. He asked Homelander if this was what passed for power in this world. Homelander tried to respond, but his voice shook slightly. He stared at something over the man's shoulder that no one else could see. His heat vision flickered on and off without firing, as if he couldn't decide what was real enough to target. The man's eyes glowed faintly red. Across the street, two more Supes who had arrived to assist suddenly dropped their weapons and backed away, screaming that they could see the battlefield around them. They described fire, bodies, and a sky filled with meteors that weren't there. Pedestrians ran from the scene, not because they were attacked, but because the Supes looked like they had lost their minds. Butcher whispered to himself that this wasn't a fight. This was control. The man stepped past Homelander without touching him. As he walked, Homelander turned slowly to follow him with his eyes, breathing harder than he ever had after physical combat. He didn't pursue. He didn't attack. He looked like a man trying to wake up from a nightmare that wouldn't end. Inside Vought, someone finally pulled a name from an obscure global database that had nothing to do with Compound V or Supes. A name attached to myth, war, and impossible battles from another world. Madara Uchiha. They didn't understand what it meant yet. They only understood that every Supe who looked directly at him was collapsing without a single blow being exchanged. On the street, Madara continued walking, leaving behind Supes who were still whispering to hallucinations that hadn't faded. He moved like a general inspecting enemy defenses, not like a man exploring a new city. As he turned the corner, another Supe arrived at high speed, confident and loud, shouting threats before he even landed. The moment his eyes met Madara's, he froze mid-word. Then he dropped to his knees and began apologizing to someone who wasn't there. Behind Madara, sirens grew louder as more responders arrived to a situation none of them could understand. And in the reflection of a shattered storefront window, Vought's cameras caught the first clear image of his eyes glowing red in the glass. The collapse hadn't started with violence. It had started with perception. Homelander did not follow Madara immediately. He stood in the middle of the ruined street, breathing harder than he wanted anyone to notice, eyes darting across a city that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The hallucinations had faded the moment Madara turned the corner, but the memory of them lingered with disturbing clarity. He had seen a battlefield where skyscrapers burned like torches and a sky filled with falling fire. And it had felt real. Around him, the Supes who had collapsed earlier were still on the ground, whispering to themselves, unable to stand. Paramedics approached cautiously, unsure how to treat injuries that didn't exist. Cameras caught Homelander looking unsettled for the first time in years, and Vought's media team immediately began issuing orders to suppress the footage. Inside Vought International, executives argued over language. They couldn't call this an attack because nothing had physically happened. They couldn't call it a power because their instruments had detected nothing. Yet 5 Supes were effectively neutralized by a man who had never raised his hand. They replayed the footage of Madara's eyes frame by frame. Every Supe who looked directly into them experienced the same psychological collapse. One analyst whispered a word none of them liked. Weaponized perception. High above the street, Homelander finally took off, flying toward the direction Madara had gone. This time, he didn't rush. He stayed at a distance, observing from above like a predator unsure whether the prey might turn out to be something else entirely. Madara walked calmly through Manhattan as if he had memorized the layout in seconds. He didn't stop for traffic. He didn't react to sirens. He moved with quiet confidence, eyes scanning buildings, billboards, security cameras, and crowds with the precision of someone evaluating infrastructure, not scenery. From a nearby rooftop, Billy Butcher tracked both of them through a scope, muttering that Homelander had never stalked anything in his life. The shift in behavior told Butcher more than the fight itself. Homelander wasn't hunting. He was studying. 2 more Supes arrived ahead of Madara, trying to intercept him before he reached a crowded plaza. They didn't know what had happened earlier. They only knew someone was causing chaos and needed to be stopped. They landed confidently in front of him, shouting orders. Madara didn't slow down. He looked at them once. Both Supes froze mid-sentence. One dropped his weapon. The other began backing away slowly, eyes wide as if seeing something horrifying unfold in front of him. They didn't attack. They didn't defend. They simply broke. Civilians scattered again, not from violence, but from the unsettling sight of Supes losing composure in public. Homelander landed behind Madara this time, careful not to step directly into his line of sight. He spoke again, louder, angrier, demanding that Madara stop and explain himself. The words felt weaker even as he said them. Madara turned his head slightly, just enough for Homelander to see the edge of his eye. That was enough. Homelander's voice faltered mid-threat as the same sensation crept back into his mind. The city warped for a split second. The sky darkened. He heard distant explosions that weren't happening. He forced himself to look away before the vision could fully take hold. That realization struck him harder than any punch. He couldn't even maintain eye contact. From Vaught's surveillance feeds, executives watched their most powerful asset deliberately avoiding someone's gaze. One of them finally said what everyone was thinking. "He's afraid to look at him." Madara resumed walking as if the conversation had bored him. Homelander followed at a distance, unwilling to engage directly but unable to leave. The dynamic had flipped without a single physical exchange. Butcher lowered his scope and whispered that this was the part Vought wouldn't recover from. Because strength meant nothing if perception could be controlled. As Madara entered a large public square, dozens of civilians were forced to pass near him before they could flee. Something strange happened. They didn't collapse. They didn't hallucinate. They simply moved aside instinctively, as if their minds understood they were in the presence of something they shouldn't challenge. Madara wasn't targeting them. He was choosing who to break. A squad of Vought tactical agents tried to block his path, rifles raised. They had been briefed to avoid eye contact and rely on instruments. They moved cautiously, trying to treat him like a normal hostile target. Madara stopped walking. Without looking directly at them, he raised one hand slightly. The air shifted. The ground beneath the agents cracked outward in a perfect circle as an invisible force pressed them into the pavement. Not violently, just firmly enough that they couldn't move. Their rifles fell from their hands as they struggled against pressure they couldn't see. Madara lowered his hand and continued walking. Homelander watched the entire exchange in silence, realizing something that unsettled him deeply. Madara hadn't needed to use his eyes for that. Whatever this was, it went far beyond psychological tricks. Inside Vought, analysts scrambled to label what they had just seen: telekinesis, gravity manipulation, unknown field effect. None of the terms felt accurate enough. Because Madara didn't look like he was exerting effort. He looked like he was demonstrating. As he exited the square, Homelander finally stopped following. He hovered in place, watching Madara's back disappear into another street. For the first time in his life, he considered not engaging a threat because he didn't understand how to fight it. Butcher saw the hesitation from the rooftop and smiled grimly. This wasn't a fight Homelander could win by hitting harder. This was a fight where looking was losing. Madara turned a corner and disappeared from direct line of sight. Moments later, reports came in from 3 blocks away. More Supes collapsing without injury. More officers pinned to the ground without being touched. Vought's command center went quiet as they tracked his path across the city like a slow-moving catastrophe that never exploded but left dysfunction in its wake. They had prepared for battles. They were watching a dismantling. By the time the 3rd cluster of incidents was reported, Vought International stopped calling it a threat and started calling it a pattern. Madara wasn't moving randomly. His path traced infrastructure, transit hubs, corporate corridors, media centers, emergency routes, places that controlled how the city functioned rather than how it looked. Analysts overlaid his route on a systems map and felt a quiet chill. He had walked past 3 broadcast stations, 2 police command posts, and a data relay node without pausing. Each site reported equipment glitches and personnel confusion shortly after he passed. No sabotage, no intrusion. Just disruption that felt intentional. Inside the tower, executives watched security feeds from dozens of angles as Madara approached Midtown. He didn't look at cameras directly, yet the footage showed him glancing past lenses as if he knew exactly where they were. The unnerving part wasn't that he could see them. It was that he didn't care to hide from them. From a rooftop across the avenue, Billy Butcher tracked Madara's movement with a small drone, muttering that this wasn't reconnaissance. This was appraisal, the way a general studies walls before deciding where to knock. On a side street, a pair of Vought media handlers tried to stage a controlled response. They placed a camera crew at a safe distance to capture footage that could be spun later. As Madara passed, the cameraman's hands began to shake. He lowered the lens and whispered that the street behind Madara looked wrong, like the buildings were leaning inward. The producer told him to keep filming. He dropped the camera and walked away without another word. High above, Homelander listened to the reports through a secure channel, jaw tight. He had expected Madara to lash out, to create chaos he could counter with strength. Instead, he watched a man calmly gather information from the city without touching anything. That made him feel exposed. Madara slowed as he reached a wide boulevard lined with corporate glass. He paused for the first time since arriving and looked up at the skyline. His gaze moved from building to building with deliberate focus, taking in logos, antenna arrays, reflective surfaces. Across the street, pedestrians felt an instinctive urge to cross away from him. Inside Vought, someone realized the uncomfortable truth. He wasn't wandering into their territory by accident. He was mapping it in real time. A tactical team was dispatched with strict orders. Do not engage, do not speak, do not make eye contact. Their job was to observe from close range and report behavior. They followed at a careful distance, eyes down, relying on peripheral vision and instruments. Madara resumed walking. Without turning his head, he spoke in a calm voice that carried across the street. He commented on how primitive their attempt at surveillance was. He mentioned the number of cameras on the nearest building without looking at it. He noted the team behind him by count, not by sound. The team stopped in place. They hadn't made a noise. On Vought's screens, executives watched their operatives hesitate as if caught doing something embarrassing. One finally whispered into his mic that the target was aware of their presence without visual confirmation. Madara turned a corner toward Vought Tower. Inside the building, a ripple of unease spread across floors without anyone knowing why. Employees felt watched from inside their own offices. Security guards checked empty hallways twice. Elevators paused between floors for a fraction of a second longer than usual. No alarms triggered. But the building reacted. From the rooftop, Butcher exhaled slowly. He could see it now. Madara wasn't attacking Vought. He was letting Vought feel what it was like to be observed without control. Homelander hovered several blocks away, watching Madara approach the tower that symbolized his authority. He felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This man understood power structures instinctively. Madara stopped across the street from Vought Tower and looked up at it in silence. The glass facade reflected his armored silhouette back at him, multiplied across dozens of windows. For a moment, it looked like the building was filled with copies of him. Inside, employees began reporting strange sensations. Hallways felt longer than they should. Offices felt smaller. A receptionist said the lobby ceiling looked lower even though it was. Madara hadn't stepped inside. Yet the building felt altered. An executive whispered that this was psychological contagion. Another corrected him quietly. This was demonstration. Madara was showing them that control could be exerted without contact. After a long pause, Madara turned away from the tower and continued walking. The relief inside Vought lasted less than a second. Because they realized something worse. He hadn't approached to attack. He had approached to understand. And now he was leaving with that understanding. Across the city, new reports came in of Supes collapsing in districts Madara had passed through earlier, long after he had moved on. Officers described delayed hallucinations. Civilians reported brief visual distortions near places he had walked. The effect lingered. Butcher shook his head and muttered that this wasn't a man passing through a city. This was a man leaving fingerprints on how the city perceived itself. As dusk settled over Manhattan, Madara crossed a bridge into another district without looking back at the skyline. Behind him, Vought's command center filled with quiet dread. Because they no longer felt like they were tracking him. They felt like he had already finished tracking them. It started mid-morning without Madara anywhere in sight. A receptionist in Midtown reported that the hallway outside her desk looked longer than it should. She blinked twice and it returned to normal. 10 minutes later, a delivery driver abandoned his cart in the same building, whispering that the ceiling was lowering inch by inch. Security footage showed nothing unusual, only a man backing away from empty air. Across town, traffic stopped at an intersection when 3 drivers stepped out of their cars at once, staring at something above the street. They shielded their eyes from a sun that hadn't moved and pointed at shapes no one else could see. The light looked normal on camera. Inside Vought International, reports flooded in faster than analysts could categorize them. Civilians, office workers, police, not Supes, all describing subtle distortions in space, perspective, and distance in places Madara had walked hours earlier. Someone whispered that this was mass hysteria. Another pointed to the map and said hysteria didn't follow a trail. From a rooftop vantage point, Billy Butcher listened to police scanners and realized the pattern before Vought did. The hallucinations weren't random. They were tied to geography. Streets Madara had passed through were now causing perception errors for anyone spending too long inside them. He muttered that this was the part where people started doubting their own eyes. High above the skyline, Homelander watched crowds from a distance. He saw pedestrians hesitate at crosswalks, look around nervously, then hurry away without knowing why. He told himself this was panic from earlier events. But even he could feel something off when he descended lower. A squad of Supes was dispatched to reassure the public, smiling for cameras and pretending everything was under control. They walked through one of the affected streets with forced confidence. 30 seconds later, one of them stopped talking mid-sentence and stared at the building across from him. He whispered that the windows were blinking. They weren't. The rest of the squad backed away slowly, trying to maintain composure for the cameras while their eyes darted in confusion. Viewers at home saw Supes lose focus without any visible cause. The footage spread online before Vought could contain it. They weren't being attacked. They were being unmade. Madara walked quietly along the waterfront several blocks away, nowhere near the growing disturbances. He paused briefly to watch the river move, eyes calm, posture relaxed. He didn't look like a man orchestrating chaos. He looked like someone who had already finished setting it in motion. Inside Vought Tower, employees began reporting similar sensations in rooms Madara had never entered. Hallways felt narrower. Reflections in glass surfaces looked slightly delayed. Security guards felt watched by spaces that should have been empty. An executive finally said what no one wanted to admit. This wasn't proximity anymore. This was influence. Butcher pieced it together while listening to scanner chatter. Madara wasn't directly affecting people. He was altering how the environment was perceived. Anyone moving through those spaces long enough began to see the world slightly wrong. And the mind filled in the rest. On a crowded plaza, a street performer dropped his guitar and ran after staring at the sky too long. A group of office workers followed him without knowing why. Police, arriving at the scene, felt the same unease and left quickly without filing a report. The city wasn't under attack. It was losing confidence in its own reality. Homelander finally descended into one of the affected areas to prove to himself he could stand inside it without issue. He walked down the sidewalk slowly, eyes forward, refusing to look at reflections or windows. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he noticed the sound of his own footsteps seemed delayed by half a second. He stopped walking. The sound continued for one extra step. He looked around sharply. The street was empty. He flew upward instantly, retreating to the air where nothing could distort around him. From above, the city looked normal again, and that contrast unsettled him more than anything else had. Madara resumed walking from the waterfront into another district, not looking at the growing consequences behind him. Civilians ahead of him moved out of his path instinctively without knowing why. He didn't target them. He didn't need to. Vought's analysts overlaid new reports onto the map and saw the truth clearly now. The city wasn't hallucinating randomly. It was hallucinating along the exact route Madara had taken the previous day. His passage had left behind something intangible that lingered in place. Butcher lowered his radio and whispered that this was how you dismantled a system without breaking a single wall. You made everyone doubt the space those walls stood in. As evening approached, entire blocks were quietly avoided by pedestrians without official orders. Businesses closed early. Offices emptied faster than usual. No one announced it. People simply chose not to remain in places that felt wrong. And Madara kept walking, calm and observant, through a city that was slowly learning not to trust what it saw. By nightfall, the Pentagon stopped waiting for Vaught's explanations. Civilian reports had grown too consistent, too patterned, to dismiss as hysteria. Entire streets were being avoided without official closures. Supes were refusing assignments in certain districts without being able to explain why. The language in briefings shifted from incident to environmental anomaly. They sent teams to measure it. Soldiers entered Midtown carrying portable sensors designed to detect radiation, electromagnetic interference, chemical agents, and sonic disruption. They moved carefully, expecting a field they could chart, a variable they could isolate. The streets looked normal under streetlights. Air readings were clean. Devices showed nothing unusual. The soldiers still felt watched. Inside Vought International, analysts observed the military feeds with growing discomfort. They had tried the same approach earlier and found nothing. Now they watched trained operators experience the same unease civilians had described, despite instruments telling them everything was fine. One soldier whispered over comms that the buildings felt closer together than the map suggested. Another asked if the street had always been that narrow. The team leader ordered them to focus on readings, not feelings. A drone lifted into the air to scan the block from above. Its camera showed straight lines, normal spacing, clear geometry. On the ground, the soldiers still hesitated to walk forward. From a nearby rooftop, Billy Butcher watched the scene unfold and muttered that this was the worst part. You couldn't fight what you couldn't record, and soldiers trusted data more than instinct. High above the skyline, Homelander listened to the military chatter with quiet irritation. He had expected them to bring heavy equipment, to escalate with visible force. Instead, they were creeping through streets like ghosts, trying to measure something that wasn't there. He knew why. Because hitting it would do nothing. Madara walked several blocks away, nowhere near the soldiers, yet still within the zone they were testing. He paused at a crosswalk and observed traffic lights cycling from red to green in perfect rhythm. He watched pedestrians choose longer routes to avoid passing him without knowing why. He didn't interfere. He studied. Back on the street, the soldiers deployed small reflective panels along the sidewalk to test visual consistency. One soldier stepped between two markers and stopped. He reported that the distance between them felt longer than it should. Another soldier measured it with a tape line. The measurement was correct. The discomfort remained. A helicopter hovered overhead with a spotlight scanning the block. From above, everything looked ordinary. On the ground, one soldier lowered his rifle and whispered that he felt like he was standing inside a photograph instead of reality. His commander told him to stay focused. Inside Vought, someone finally said what they had all been avoiding. This wasn't a field. It wasn't energy. It wasn't radiation. It was perception being altered at a level too subtle for machines to detect. Madara resumed walking, crossing into another district as if he had finished evaluating the area. The soldiers, unease lingered even after he left. They reported feeling relief without knowing why. Butcher nodded to himself from the rooftop. That was the proof. The effect followed Madara's path like a stain that didn't wash away when he moved on. The Pentagon escalated again. They authorized a controlled sonic pulse from a rooftop array designed to disrupt any potential cognitive interference. The device activated, sending inaudible frequencies through the street below. Nothing changed. The soldiers still hesitated. The drone still showed normal footage. Madara didn't even turn his head. Homelander watched from above as the military's most advanced equipment failed to detect what he had felt personally. That realization unsettled him more than any physical threat could have. If this couldn't be measured, it couldn't be countered. As the soldiers began withdrawing from the area, one of them turned around suddenly and pointed down the street. He swore he had seen figures standing between buildings that vanished when he blinked. His commander ordered him to move. They left without collecting all the equipment they had placed. Inside Vought, analysts marked the block as another confirmed distortion zone. They overlaid it with Madara's route from earlier and saw perfect alignment. Every place he had walked now produced measurable behavioral changes without any measurable cause. Madara stopped at the edge of a park and looked across the trees in silence. He didn't smile. He didn't react. He simply observed how a modern city struggled to understand something that required no physical presence to dominate. Behind him, sirens faded as military vehicles left the district. The streetlights remained on. The unease remained stronger. And Madara continued forward, having learned exactly how fragile this world's sense of reality truly was. The briefings changed tone before the language caught up. In a federal situation room, analysts stopped using words like hostile, assailant, and containment. The reports from Manhattan didn't describe damage, they described behavior: streets avoided, buildings emptied, people leaving spaces without knowing why. It didn't read like a battlefield. It read like a city, quietly stepping back from something it couldn't explain. A general finally said what no one else had dared to say aloud. This wasn't an attack. There was no force to push back against, no vector to intercept. Whatever Madara was doing, it operated by altering how people experienced their surroundings rather than how those surroundings functioned. That distinction broke every protocol they had. Inside Vought International, executives listened to the government's conclusion with a quiet dread. Vought had built its empire on spectacle, on visible power, on threats you could film and spin. Madara offered none of that. He offered quiet erosion. And there was nothing to spin. From a vantage point near the river, Billy Butcher watched commuter traffic thin hours before rush hour should have ended. People left offices early without explanation. Subway platforms emptied faster than usual. No announcements were made. The city just adjusted. Butcher muttered that this was the moment control slipped through Vought's fingers without them noticing. High above the skyline, Homelander hovered in place, listening to radio chatter from police, military, and media. No one was talking about fighting back. They were talking about avoidance, about minimizing presence in affected areas. That felt like surrender disguised as caution. Madara walked through a commercial district where storefronts were still open, but employees stood near exits instead of counters. Customers browsed quickly and left without lingering. The air felt tense without visible cause. Madara didn't slow down. He didn't need to be near people for them to react. Inside the government briefing, a psychologist presented the most uncomfortable assessment yet. Madara's presence had introduced a form of cognitive stress tied to geography. People didn't feel attacked. They felt wrong. And humans instinctively removed themselves from environments that felt wrong. The government realized they couldn't order people back into those areas, because people didn't know why they were leaving in the first place. Back on the streets, a police officer stood at the edge of one of the distortion zones and hesitated to step inside. His partner asked what he was waiting for. He couldn't explain it. He just didn't want to cross an invisible line. Madara passed several blocks away, unaware of the officer, yet still influencing his decision. Butcher saw the hesitation through binoculars and whispered that this was how you dismantled authority, not by attacking it, but by making it unreliable. Inside Vought Tower, executives debated whether to issue a public statement about psychological safety. They rejected it immediately. Admitting psychological vulnerability meant admitting weakness, but staying silent allowed rumors to spread unchecked. They were trapped between two losses. Homelander descended briefly into a less affected district to reassure himself that normalcy still existed. People still cheered. Cameras still followed him. The city still reacted the way it always had. Then he looked toward the areas Madara had passed through and saw streets that felt dimmer even in daylight. He chose not to fly that way. Madara paused near a subway entrance and looked down into the dark stairwell. He didn't enter. He simply observed how commuters approaching the entrance slowed down, glanced inside, and decided to take the bus instead. No sign, no warning. Just instinct. In the situation room, a final conclusion settled over the table. This wasn't something to eliminate. It was something to manage around. They began drafting guidelines for city officials about rerouting traffic and encouraging remote work without mentioning why. The world's response to Madara had shifted from confrontation to accommodation. That was the moment they understood how dangerous this really was. Because nothing had been destroyed. Yet the city was already changing its behavior permanently. Madara resumed walking, eyes calm, posture relaxed, moving through a world that was quietly rearranging itself without his direct input. And no one had found a way to tell it not to. For days Madara had walked, observed, measured, allowed the city to unravel itself without lifting more than a hand. That restraint had confused Vought, unsettled the military, and broken Homelander's confidence without a single visible display of force. Then, in the early evening light of a wide avenue, he stopped. No sirens, no alarms, just a quiet pause at an intersection where traffic had already grown thin. Pedestrians on the sidewalk slowed instinctively, unsure why their attention had fixed on a man who wasn't doing anything. Several blocks away, a Vought tactical squad received orders they had been waiting for since the first day. Engage. Inside Vought International, executives argued that letting this continue passively would destroy public confidence entirely. They needed footage, action, something they could point to and say, "We are fighting this." So they sent a mixed team of mid-tier Supes and trained operatives toward Madara's location. From a rooftop overlooking the avenue, Billy Butcher saw them coming and muttered that this was the mistake he had been waiting for. High above, Homelander hovered at a distance, watching through cloud cover. He didn't move closer. He wanted to see what happened when someone forced Madara to respond. The team spread out, careful not to make eye contact. They had been briefed extensively. Use peripheral vision. Use ranged attacks. Avoid psychological exposure. They approached like professionals handling a biohazard. Madara remained still. One Supe fired first, launching a concussive blast down the street meant to knock him off balance. The air rippled violently toward him, shattering windows and tearing up asphalt. Madara raised one arm casually. The blast stopped midair. Not deflected, not absorbed. Stopped. The shockwave hung there for a fraction of a second like a frozen image, before dispersing harmlessly around him. The squad froze. Madara lowered his arm and took a single step forward. The ground cracked outward in a perfect circle beneath the team as invisible pressure slammed them to their knees. Rifles clattered to the pavement. Supes strained against a force they couldn't see or fight, muscles trembling as if gravity had suddenly doubled. Madara didn't look at them. He walked past. One Supe tried to look up despite instructions. Their eyes met for less than a second. He screamed. Not from pain, but from what he was seeing. He shouted about fire falling from the sky, about armies in the streets, about a war no one else could see. He clawed at the pavement, trying to crawl away from visions that only existed in his mind. The others turned their heads away in panic. From the rooftop, Butcher exhaled slowly. This was the first time Madara had responded with something undeniable, something cameras could capture, something Vought could not spin. On Vaught's screens, executives watched their team crumble in seconds. No explosions, no visible combat, just Supes and soldiers pinned to the ground and psychologically shattered by brief eye contact. Homelander watched from above and felt a tightness in his chest that he refused to name. Madara hadn't escalated in anger. He had demonstrated the gap between them. Madara reached the center of the avenue and stopped again. Then he looked up at the surrounding buildings. His eyes glowed faintly red. Windows along the street began to crack simultaneously without being touched, not shattered from impact, but splitting from internal pressure. Glass spiderwebbed outward across entire facades as if the buildings themselves were reacting to his presence. Pedestrians watching from a distance ran in panic as the sound of cracking glass filled the air. Madara lowered his gaze. The cracks stopped. He hadn't attacked the buildings. He had shown he could. The squad on the ground was finally released from the invisible pressure, gasping for breath. None of them stood. None of them tried to continue the mission. They crawled backward like men escaping a nightmare. Madara resumed walking. Behind him, the street was filled with evidence that something catastrophic had happened without visible cause. Cameras had recorded everything, and there was no way to edit it into something manageable. Butcher muttered that this was the moment Vought lost control of the narrative permanently. Homelander remained in the sky long after Madara disappeared around the corner. He didn't follow. He didn't intervene. He simply watched a street filled with broken glass and broken confidence. Madara had finally acted. And it had taken less than 10 seconds to show the city how fragile everything really was. The order was given quietly, without public record. No more observation, no more containment. The goal was termination. Inside a dim command room, military planners worked alongside handlers from Vought International to coordinate something they had avoided for days. Long-range snipers on rooftops, attack helicopters circling out of sight, precision munitions locked onto a moving target through thermal imaging. They believed distance would solve the problem. Madara walked down an empty avenue as if he already knew. From 3 rooftops, snipers lined up the shot. They had been briefed to avoid eye contact, to trust instruments, to fire simultaneously. Their scopes tracked the center of his back as he crossed an intersection littered with cracked glass from earlier. The command came through. They fired. The bullets reached him. They slowed. Not from armor, not from deflection. They simply lost momentum in midair and dropped to the pavement around his feet with soft metallic taps. Madara didn't turn around. He kept walking. One sniper whispered that the wind must have shifted. Another fired again, adjusting for imaginary error. The result was the same. Rounds fell harmlessly before touching him. Then the sniper's breathing changed. He swore he could see figures standing behind him on the rooftop. He turned instinctively. His comm feed went silent. Across the other rooftops, similar whispers cut off mid-sentence. No gunfire, no struggle, just absence. On the street, Madara stopped walking. Attack helicopters roared into position overhead, floodlights sweeping across buildings. A missile streaked downward from above with a controlled explosion designed to erase the entire block. The blast swallowed the street in fire and debris, shattering windows for blocks in every direction. From a rooftop vantage point, Billy Butcher watched the fireball rise and shook his head slowly. He already knew what the smoke would reveal. When it cleared, Madara stood at the center of a perfect ring of destruction. Asphalt around him had been pulverized. Cars flipped. Streetlights bent. Yet the ground directly beneath his feet was untouched, as if the explosion had curved politely around him. Above the smoke, Homelander hovered, watching in silence. He had hoped quietly that this would work, not because he trusted the plan, but because he wanted proof that Madara could be handled without him risking another encounter. The proof came. And it wasn't what he wanted. Madara finally turned around. Not toward the helicopters. Toward the rooftops where the snipers had been. His eyes glowed faintly red. The helicopter pilots reported visual distortions immediately. One shouted that the skyline looked wrong, like buildings were bending inward. Another screamed that the street below had turned into a battlefield filled with bodies that weren't there. One helicopter veered off course and clipped a building before crashing into the street below. The second retreated without orders. Inside the command room, officers watched camera feeds dissolve into chaos. Instruments showed nothing wrong. Pilots' voices said otherwise. The contradiction broke discipline faster than any attack could have. Madara stepped forward out of the crater. The street was silent except for distant sirens. He didn't pursue the helicopters. He didn't look for survivors. He simply resumed walking, as if the attempt on his life had been a brief interruption in his evaluation of the city. Butcher lowered his binoculars and muttered that this was the moment they understood something permanent. You couldn't kill a man who didn't need to be touched by what you fired at him. Homelander remained in the sky long after Madara disappeared down another street. He felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Madara hadn't defended himself with effort. He had allowed them to demonstrate how powerless they were. Across the city, reports came in of people seeing flashes of fire in reflections that weren't happening. The failed strike had left behind another layer of distortion in the environment, extending the areas people instinctively avoided. The attempt to end Madara had done the opposite. It had widened his influence. The city watched without knowing it was watching. Word had spread through rumors, clipped footage, and half-erased broadcasts that something had happened on that avenue the night before. People avoided the area instinctively, yet a few lingered at the edges, staring down the street as if expecting it to do something. High above, Homelander hovered in the fading light, staring at the trail Madara had left behind. Cracked windows, scarred asphalt, silence where there should have been noise. He felt something in his chest that he translated into anger because the alternative felt worse. He descended. This time there were no cameras, no Vought handlers whispering into his ear, no audience to perform for. He landed in the middle of the damaged street and waited. Madara turned the corner minutes later, walking at the same calm pace he always had. He didn't look surprised to see Homelander there. He didn't look interested. Homelander spoke first, voice steady but carrying strain underneath. He said this ends now. He said the city belonged to him. He said Madara had made enough of a spectacle. Madara didn't respond. He kept walking. Homelander moved faster than sound, appearing directly in front of him and blocking the path. He refused to look into Madara's eyes this time, keeping his gaze fixed on the armor, the chest, anything but the face. He fired heat vision without warning. The beam struck Madara's chest and split around him like water hitting stone, carving two molten lines into the street behind. Madara didn't move. Homelander roared and struck with everything he had, a punch capable of leveling buildings. Madara caught his wrist. Effortlessly. The impact that should have shattered the street died in Madara's grip, as if physics had been politely asked to stop. Homelander's eyes widened as he tried to pull free and couldn't. Madara looked at him. Just for a second. That was enough. The street vanished from Homelander's mind. In its place, he saw a battlefield under a red sky, meteors falling in slow arcs, thousands of bodies stretching into the distance. He heard screams, explosions, and felt heat that wasn't there. He staggered backward, breaking the grip himself in panic. From a distant rooftop, Billy Butcher watched through a scope, heart pounding. He had wanted to see Homelander humbled. He hadn't expected to see him look lost. Homelander swung wildly, trying to hit something real. His punches shattered cars and pavement, but Madara wasn't where he thought he was. Every time he attacked, he hit empty space while the hallucination twisted around him. Madara stepped to the side calmly, observing. He wasn't fighting. He was demonstrating. Homelander blasted upward into the sky, trying to clear his vision with distance. The hallucination followed for a split second longer before fading. He hovered high above, breathing heavily, looking down at a street that had returned to normal. Madara stood below, exactly where he had been. Homelander realized the horrifying truth. He couldn't tell what was real when Madara decided he shouldn't. He descended again, slower this time, more cautious. He tried to speak, but the words felt hollow even to him. Madara listened without expression, then spoke quietly for the first time in minutes. He asked Homelander if this was what passed for divinity in this world. Homelander had no response. Madara stepped past him. Homelander didn't stop him. On the rooftops, Butcher lowered his scope and exhaled slowly. This wasn't a loss in the way he had imagined. This was worse. Homelander hadn't been beaten physically. He had been shown he wasn't in control of his own perception. As Madara walked away, pedestrians at the far end of the block scattered without knowing why. The city felt heavier in his wake. The air seemed quieter. Homelander remained standing in the middle of the street long after Madara disappeared from view. He didn't chase. He didn't shout. He simply stared at the ground where he had swung at ghosts. For the first time in his life, he understood something he had never had to consider before. Power meant nothing if you couldn't trust what you were seeing. The first thing Vought tried to do was control the footage. Clips of Supes collapsing without injury, soldiers pinned to pavement by nothing, Homelander swinging at empty air, helicopters veering off course because pilots saw things that weren't there. The media team worked through the night to scrub, edit, and replace anything that showed confusion instead of dominance. It didn't work, because the problem wasn't what people saw on screens anymore. It was what they felt on the streets. Inside Vought International, executives watched public behavior shift in real time. Entire districts saw declining foot traffic without official warnings. Businesses closed early without explanation. People crossed streets instinctively to avoid certain blocks. No announcement had caused this. Madara had. From a hidden vantage point, Billy Butcher watched reporters set up near one of the affected avenues. They tried to film normal life, smiling into cameras while the street behind them emptied gradually. Pedestrians refused to pass through the frame, not wanting to stand in that location for too long. The segment was cut short. Vought realized something terrifying. Their entire system depended on being able to define reality for the public. If they couldn't explain what was happening, they couldn't control the response to it. High above, Homelander listened to executives arguing through the glass of a conference room he didn't enter. They weren't discussing strategy. They were discussing liability, evacuation, image preservation. He had never heard them talk like that before. Madara walked calmly past corporate districts where lights remained on but offices stood half empty. Reflections in glass followed him a fraction of a second too late, creating the illusion that he existed slightly out of sync with the city itself. He didn't look at the buildings. He didn't need to. Inside Vought Tower, employees reported feeling watched in hallways where no one stood. Elevators paused between floors without explanation. Security guards avoided certain corridors without knowing why. Madara hadn't entered the building. Yet the building felt altered. An executive whispered the truth in a voice barely above a breath. This wasn't an attack on Vought. This was an exposure of how fragile their control over perception really was. They ordered a quiet evacuation of several floors without public notice. Butcher watched the movement through traffic cameras and shook his head slowly. This was the moment he had waited years to see, but it didn't feel satisfying. Vought wasn't being overthrown by rebellion. It was being made irrelevant. Madara paused briefly across the street from the tower, looking up at the glass facade. For a moment, his reflection multiplied across hundreds of windows, as if the building was filled with copies of him. Inside, several employees reported sudden dizziness and left early without explanation. Madara turned and walked away. That was enough. Vought's leadership realized something worse than destruction. He hadn't needed to enter their headquarters to make it feel compromised. The idea that he could was sufficient. Homelander remained outside, watching the building that had defined his identity slowly empty from the inside. He didn't go in. He didn't reassure anyone. He felt like a spectator to the collapse of something he had always assumed was permanent. Across the city, quiet zones expanded without official labels. People learned their boundaries through instinct, not instruction. Life reorganized itself around areas that felt wrong, and Vought had no narrative to explain it. Madara continued walking, calm and observant, through streets that no longer belonged to the system that once claimed them. The narrative wasn't lost in a battle. It dissolved because no one could describe what they were fighting. The change became undeniable when reports arrived from cities Madara had never visited. Los Angeles commuters described streets that felt compressed during rush hour, like the air itself resisted movement. London transit workers reported platforms where sound didn't echo correctly. Tokyo office towers saw employees leave early because hallways felt longer than they should. None of these places had Supes collapsing. None had military presence. But the descriptions were identical. Inside international briefings, analysts overlaid timelines and saw the pattern spreading outward from New York like ripples in water. Not through travel, not through contact, through awareness, through the precedent Madara had introduced into the world's understanding of space and control. They stopped asking how to stop him. They started asking how far this would go. Back in Manhattan, Billy Butcher listened to foreign news feeds and realized something chilling. This wasn't a localized event anymore. It was a concept spreading globally. People had seen what happened when perception could be manipulated, and now they were unconsciously applying that fear to their own environments. Butcher muttered that Madara had infected the world without touching it. Inside the half-empty halls of Vought International, security feeds showed nothing unusual. Yet employees still reported unease in rooms Madara had never been near. The building no longer felt like a place of authority. It felt like a structure waiting to be questioned. High above the skyline, Homelander listened to military channels across continents. Generals spoke with the same frustration Vought had days earlier. They weren't discussing offense. They were discussing avoidance, how to reroute civilians without causing panic, how to minimize time spent in affected areas. That was when Homelander understood something he hated. This wasn't a threat to fight. It was a presence to survive around. Madara walked quietly through a nearly empty district at dusk, shadows stretching long across the pavement. The few pedestrians still outside stepped away from his path instinctively, not from fear of violence, but from a sense that standing near him was a mistake. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. A news helicopter tried to capture footage from a distance. The live feed showed Madara walking calmly through an empty street before the camera operator began whispering that the buildings looked like they were leaning inward. The broadcast cut abruptly. That clip spread worldwide before anyone could erase it. Governments stopped issuing defensive orders and began issuing advisories about limiting exposure to certain areas. They avoided mentioning why. They simply told people to avoid places that felt wrong. The world had shifted from resistance to accommodation. Butcher turned off the feeds and leaned back, realizing the scale of what had happened. Madara hadn't conquered anything. He had demonstrated how fragile control really was, and now the world was adjusting itself accordingly. Homelander descended briefly into a normal district where people still smiled and waved. He forced himself to play the role they expected. Then he looked toward the quiet zones and chose not to fly that way. Madara stopped at an intersection and looked down a long, empty avenue. The streetlights flickered slightly as if struggling to commit to illuminating the space. He observed it calmly, then continued walking. Across oceans, in cities he had never seen, people stepped back from shadows that felt slightly deeper than they should. The world hadn't been defeated. It had accepted that fighting back didn't make sense. The world did not end in fire. It ended in adjustment. Weeks after Madara first walked through Manhattan, cities across the globe had learned to live around spaces that felt subtly wrong. No barricades, no warning signs, just quiet avoidance of streets and buildings that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. They called them quiet zones. No one called them safe. Inside the hollowed floors of Vought International, lights still flickered in empty offices. Desks remained untouched. Elevators still worked. Yet the building felt like something had passed through it and changed how it was perceived forever. Vought still existed, but it no longer defined anything. From a vantage point overlooking the river, Billy Butcher watched commuters take longer routes to avoid certain blocks. He had spent years trying to break Vought's grip on the world. Madara had done it by showing the world how easily perception could be taken away. Butcher realized the fight he dedicated his life to had become irrelevant. Not solved. A groan. High above, Homelander no longer hovered over the city with pride. He still appeared on television, still smiled for cameras, still played the part, but he avoided flying over the quiet zones without admitting why. Because he knew what waited there. A reminder that power meant nothing if you couldn't trust your own senses. On an empty avenue bathed in early light, Madara walked alone. The streets behind him looked untouched, yet permanently changed. Reflections in windows still felt slightly delayed. Hallways in nearby buildings still felt longer than they should. People still stepped aside instinctively when they saw him, even if they didn't recognize why. He had never raised his voice, never declared intent, never demanded control. He had simply walked, and the world had rearranged itself around that fact. Reports continued from cities he had never visited, subtle distortions, unease in familiar spaces, people leaving rooms earlier than they meant to. The pattern no longer required his presence. The precedent was enough. Madara paused at an intersection and looked down a silent street. His expression remained calm, unreadable. He had not conquered this world. He had demonstrated how fragile its sense of reality truly was. He resumed walking. Behind him, the quiet zones remained, not expanding violently but persisting permanently, a reminder that control, once questioned, never fully returns. The world had not been destroyed. It had been taught something it could never unlearn.